The morning begins with the hum of daily life, but your world is about to change forever. Imagine yourself as a child in ancient Rome, no older than 8, standing in the courtyard of your family's home. The marble floor is cool beneath your bare feet, and you can smell bread baking in the nearby ovens. Your mother is weaving while humming a soft tune, and your father is speaking with a guest about trade. Everything feels safe, ordinary, almost comforting. But then it happens. A sharp, ceremonial sound cuts through the neighborhood, the long, echoing blare of sacred horns. Everyone stops. Heads turn. Hearts sink. The Pontifex Maximus has arrived. This is no ordinary visit. This is the highest priest in Rome, the man who carries authority not only over temples but over lives. And today, he has come to make his selection. You don't know it yet, but you are about to be chosen for a role that Rome calls the highest honor. A role that, in reality, will strip away your freedom, your childhood, and eventually your humanity. He looks at you, and his gaze freezes time. With a slow, deliberate motion, he raises his staff and declares words that make your mother collapse and your father turn to stone. This one serves Vesta. To neighbors, it sounds like divine blessing. To your family, it is the beginning of a nightmare. To you, it feels like being lifted above the rest, unaware that you have just been condemned to a lifetime of sacred suffering. Before we dive deeper into these hidden stories of cruelty and survival, let me pause here. If you're fascinated by history's untold truths, the dark corners that textbooks avoid, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. And tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from. I love knowing how these ancient stories reach us across time and space, connecting us even though centuries divide us. Now let's continue. The title of Vestal Virgin was framed as one of the greatest privileges for a Roman girl. You were said to be chosen by the goddess Vesta herself, the guardian of the eternal flame that kept the Roman state alive. On the surface, this sounded like elevation, luxury, honor, divine favor. But when we look closer, the truth emerges. This was not an invitation. It was an abduction cloaked in religion. Families didn't celebrate when their daughters were selected. They hid them. They lied about illnesses, smeared their faces with blemishes to make them appear unsuitable, even sent them away to distant relatives. Why? Because they knew what awaited inside the house of Vestals. Once chosen, a girl's old life ended that very day. She was taken from her family, her name erased, replaced with a title that marked her as belonging not to herself but to Rome. She could no longer inherit from her parents, own property, or even write a private letter. Her body, her words, her very existence became property of the state. Imagine marble columns and lush gardens surrounding her new home, a palace that seemed to shine with privilege. But within those walls, the beauty hid chains more binding than iron. The House of Vestals was described as the most beautiful prison in the empire. What were the rules of this sacred life? There were 3, and each one was a chain. First, perpetual virginity for 30 years. No marriage, no intimacy, no possibility of forming a family of your own. Second, absolute obedience to the Pontifex Maximus and senior priests. Your will was erased, your choices reduced to none. Third, constant guardianship of the sacred flame of Vesta. This fire was believed to keep Rome itself alive. If it went out, the city's protection was gone. Failure was considered not just negligence but treason against the gods and the empire. On the surface, Rome told these girls they were sacred, chosen, honored above all women. But beneath that divine mask was a truth designed to control and to terrorize. These rules weren't guidelines. They were laws reinforced by punishments so horrific that even crucifixion's Rome's most infamous form of death looked merciful by comparison. Let's pause for contrast. In Roman society, women from elite families could still marry, inherit wealth, host salons, and influence politics through their households. Their lives had limits, but they retained a sense of family, identity, and choice. A Vestal virgin, by contrast, was stripped of all this under the guise of sacred duty. What appeared to be the highest honor was, in fact, one of the most complete erasures of self a society could impose. And what happened if a Vestal faltered in her impossible duties? That is where the horror begins. Rome could not execute a Vestal like a common criminal because she was considered too sacred. So instead, they developed punishments cloaked in religious ritual, punishments that preserved her sanctity on paper while destroying her body and spirit in reality. These punishments were so cruel, so creative in their torment, that they are studied today as examples of institutionalized psychological warfare. The first was known as the verberatio. If the sacred flame went out, whether through a sudden draught, an accident, or sabotage, the investigation began. The Pontifex Maximus interrogated each Vestal, isolating them in dark chambers without food or sleep until one confessed. The condemned would then face the verberatio, a ritual beating performed in darkness. She would be stripped and bound to a frame while consecrated rods, designed not to break the skin, inflicted internal injuries that killed slowly and invisibly. Her mouth was gagged because her screams were considered holy and must not be heard. Her blood was too sacred to spill, so the beatings targeted flesh and organs without breaking the skin. Victims often died days later, officially recorded as succumbing to illness rather than punishment. The secrecy of these punishments was deliberate. Ordinary Romans rarely knew they occurred. The public saw the Vestals as divine figures, guardians of Rome. Behind temple walls, they endured systematic torture masked as ritual. The constant fear of failing fear that a gust of wind could doom them kept these young women in perpetual anxiety. Ancient accounts describe them trembling, aging prematurely, losing hair from stress, and becoming shadows of themselves. Rome had designed not only physical punishment but psychological conditioning so complete that survival itself became compliance. But this was only the beginning. If the beating of verberatio destroyed the sense of safety, the next punishment would erase hope itself. The crime of incestum, or breaking the vow of chastity, brought consequences so cruel that they still haunt the imagination. Imagine a young woman dressed in bridal white, led in a public procession not to a wedding but to her burial. Her mouth sealed with wax so she could not cry out. She descended into a chamber beneath the earth stocked with a lamp, a loaf of bread, a jug of water, and milk. Rome declared this was not execution. They gave her food. They let the gods decide her fate. But everyone knew the truth. The chamber was sealed, and the lamp would go out long before the food was gone. The air itself would run out, and the Vestal would die alone in suffocating darkness. Think about the cruelty of this deception. Rome called it mercy. Rome called it divine judgment. But it was nothing less than a live burial, wrapped in ceremony, hidden behind sanctity. A society that celebrated its glory in marble and gold built its empire on suffering that it refused to see. And this is where the story of the Vestals forces us to ask, was the so-called honor of service truly worth it, or was it a sentence worse than death? The burial chamber still lingers in your mind, a space barely large enough to lie down, its walls damp, the air heavy with the smell of earth. Ancient accounts describe the silence as unbearable. When the last echoes of the ceiling door faded, what remained was not just darkness, but the sound of your own heart pounding in terror. The lamp flickered, offering the illusion of safety, but deep down, you knew the flame would betray you. It was as if the goddess you had served faithfully now mocked you with her silence. This punishment, reserved for those accused of breaking their vow of chastity, was the most infamous fate of the Vestals. Yet it was not simply about killing them, it was about erasing them. No grave, no monument, no marker in history. Rome wanted to ensure these women disappeared without a trace, swallowed by the earth itself. To execute them openly would acknowledge Rome's failure in protecting its sacred virgins. To bury them alive was to shift blame onto the gods, as if the punishment had come from heaven, not men. What makes this horror even more chilling is that the charge of incestum was often political. A Vestal could be accused not because she was guilty, but because she had become inconvenient. Rival priests, ambitious senators, or even emperors themselves could use accusations to eliminate opponents. A whisper, a rumor, was enough to condemn, and once accused, a Vestal had no defense. Trials were spectacles in which the outcome was already decided. She would walk through the forum dressed in white, her silence taken as guilt, her lowered head interpreted as shame. The people did not question. They watched, and Rome continued to call it justice. Let's pause for contrast again. In Roman culture, male priests who broke sacred duties might be fined, exiled, or shamed. Brutal, yes, but survivable. Women, however, carried Rome's honor in their bodies. To control them was to control the empire's image. And so, when they faltered or were merely accused, they were not punished as individuals. They were destroyed as symbols. Their lives were consumed not just by the empire, but by its obsession with maintaining the illusion of divine favor. But if the burial chamber represented the empire's obsession with control, there was yet another punishment that exposed Rome's capacity for creative cruelty: starvation in silence. For lesser offenses, when death was not decreed, Vestals were often confined within their house, forbidden to speak, to see family, or to step into sunlight. Meals would arrive in silence, placed before them by attendants who could not make eye contact. Days turned to weeks, weeks to months. Slowly, the body weakened, but the mind fractured first. Surrounded by opulence, the painted walls, the flowing fountains, the carefully sculpted gardens, these women decayed inside gilded cages. Imagine standing in a courtyard filled with statues of goddesses, but being forbidden to raise your voice in prayer. Imagine living within arm's reach of other Vestals, but never being allowed to speak to them. The cruelty was not just physical. It was psychological warfare designed to remind them that they were sacred but powerless, honored yet silenced. Rome had perfected the art of turning the human spirit against itself. What makes these stories even more terrifying is how ordinary Romans perceived the Vestals. To the public, they were untouchable figures of reverence. They had front-row seats at gladiatorial games, their litters parted crowds like royalty, and even emperors bowed their heads before them. They could grant pardons with a mere touch, and their presence was believed to bring divine blessing. But none of this power was real. It was ceremonial theater, a mask that hid their vulnerability. The same hands that cheered their appearance would also stone their procession to the burial ground if accused. Their privilege was a cage lined with roses. Consider the irony. Vestals were celebrated for guarding the eternal flame, the symbol of Rome's immortality, yet their own lives were expendable, erased without hesitation when it suited the empire. Rome claimed to worship them, but what it truly worshipped was control. The flame mattered, not the women who fed it. The city could not tolerate even the idea of imperfection, because that imperfection threatened the myth of Rome's divine destiny. Now step back and see the bigger picture. Ancient Rome has often been romanticized as a civilization of grandeur, its aqueducts, amphitheaters, legions, and laws. Yet beneath the marble was a darkness rarely acknowledged. For all its talk of honor, the empire thrived on fear. Gladiators died for spectacle. Slaves toiled in silence. And sacred virgins, supposedly the most honored women in the empire, were buried alive, beaten in darkness, or starved in silence. If this is how Rome treated its holiest, what does it say about its soul? The punishments of the Vestals reveal something fundamental about human history. Power often cloaks cruelty in the language of honor. Rome could not admit it was afraid of disorder, afraid of failure, afraid of its own fragility. So it created scapegoats. A flame going out was not the fault of chance, it was the fault of a girl. A famine was not the fault of weather, it was the fault of a Vestal. A political rival was not eliminated by ambition, it was eliminated by piety. In every case, Rome preserved its image while sacrificing its women. Think of the silence in that underground chamber again. The earth pressing in, the lamp flickering, the lungs burning. Was this really the price of divine order? Or was it the empire's desperate attempt to control the uncontrollable? That is the question we must keep asking, because history repeats itself. Whenever a society praises someone too highly, whenever it calls them sacred, we must look closer. Who benefits from their sacrifice? And who pays the price? The story of the Vestals is not simply about ancient Rome. It is a mirror, a reminder of how power uses ritual, symbolism, and even faith to mask violence. These young women, stolen from their families at the age of 8, spent their lives serving a goddess who never spoke and a city that never cared. And when the city was done with them, it sealed them away, erasing their names, their bodies, their voices. Yet their suffering survives in whispers of history, reminding us that glory often grows from hidden graves. Picture yourself once more, walking through the marble streets of Rome, the sun striking off temples that seem eternal. Crowds gather as a procession begins. At first, it looks like a festival music, banners, people dressed in white. But then you notice the silence that creeps over the crowd as a veiled figure appears in the center. She is young, her face pale, her hands bound. A Vestal virgin accused of betraying her vows. What follows is one of the least spoken of, yet most brutal punishments of all: ritual scourging. Unlike the secret burial or the slow suffocation of isolation, scourging was public. It was theater, meant to remind Rome that purity was fragile and must be defended through pain. The Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest, would preside over the ceremony. A curtain was drawn in the temple of Vesta, not to shield her from the crowd's eyes, but to maintain a pretense of modesty. Inside, the lash would strike. Again and again. The sacred virgin beaten like a criminal, her cries muffled by stone walls, while outside the people waited, hearing echoes of her agony. This was not execution, but humiliation. The whip stripped away not only flesh but dignity. For Rome, the message was clear. Even the holiest women were subject to the same cruelty as slaves. And worse, because they carried the empire's honor, their suffering was framed as necessary, even noble. The people whispered prayers as the blows fell, as though violence itself could restore divine favor. The contradiction is staggering. Here were women who embodied Rome's eternal flame, guardians of the empire's most sacred trust, and yet the empire saw no contradiction in desecrating them with lashes. The same society that forbade anyone to touch a Vestal could sanction her brutal beating when it suited their purposes. It was not about justice. It was about control, spectacle, and fear. Think for a moment about the psychology of this punishment. To the Romans, scourging was purification. Pain cleansed dishonor. Blood wiped away impurity. But for the Vestal herself, each strike was not just physical, it was spiritual betrayal. The goddess she had served demanded silence. The city she had protected demanded her suffering. The crowd outside demanded nothing, because silence had been drilled into them as well. And so, the lash fell, echoing Rome's hypocrisy with every blow. Contrast this with the way male priests or politicians were treated. Men accused of corruption might be fined, exiled, or at worst, executed quickly. But women, because their bodies symbolized chastity, fertility, and Rome's moral image, were punished in ways designed to linger. A man's dishonor ended with his life. A vestal's dishonor lived on in scars, in whispers, in erasure. And here lies the third horror, not just the lash itself, but the legacy it left. These punishments did not vanish when the wounds healed. They haunted survivors for life. A vestal who had been scourged could never return to normal service without suspicion. The people might bow before her in the street, but in their minds she was tainted. Even after decades of faithful service, even after her hair had turned white, she could still be remembered not for guarding the flame, but for one accusation, one rumor, one punishment. This cycle of cruelty reveals the deeper truth about ancient Rome. The empire's greatness was built on the suffering of the vulnerable. Its temples rose from the stones carved by slaves. Its games were soaked in the blood of gladiators. Its sacred traditions were upheld by the torment of young women who had no choice but to serve. And yet, history often tells us only of Rome's victories, its emperors, its monuments. Rarely do we hear the cries of those silenced beneath its glory. Now let's return to you, the listener. Imagine the horns sounding again, the crowd parting, the figure of a girl dragged toward the field of Mars. You see her stumble as the earth swallows her alive. You hear the faintest cry from within the temple of Vesta as the lash falls again and again. You picture the lonely silence of a courtyard where once laughing girls now sit mute, their voices stolen by fear. These are not just ancient images. They are warnings. Every empire, every nation, every culture risks repeating Rome's sins when it sacrifices the innocent to preserve power. Whenever a society elevates people as symbols rather than humans, it risks turning them into victims. The Vestals remind us that glory often hides cruelty, and that behind every monument of power are bones buried in silence. So the next time you hear Rome praised as the height of civilization, remember the voices it buried alive. Remember the women it starved in silence. Remember the sacred virgins it lashed in darkness. And ask yourself, is this greatness, or is it fear dressed in marble? If you've stayed with me through this journey into the shadows of ancient Rome, I want to hear from you. What shocked you the most, the burial alive, the silence of starvation, or the ritual scourging? Leave your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more untold histories like this, stories that peel back the marble to show the blood beneath, make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me where in the world you're watching from. Because history should not just be remembered, it should be felt. And together, we can keep these forgotten voices alive. Step back for a moment and picture the Roman Forum, alive with voices, footsteps, and the clang of iron against stone. Merchants call out their wares, senators stride in flowing togas, soldiers march in disciplined formation. At the heart of this world, within the shadow of temples and arches, stood a small, circular structure, the Temple of Vesta. Modest in size compared to the towering monuments around it, yet within its walls burned a flame more important than all the banners, swords, and coins of Rome combined. That flame was said to be the soul of the empire, and the girls chosen to guard it were told they were serving not men, but eternity. The reality, as we've seen, was far more brutal. The Vestals were not just guardians of fire, they were instruments of control. Rome built its myths carefully, and the Vestals were at the center of them. Their purity symbolized Rome's divine favor. Their obedience reassured the people that the gods still smiled upon the city. But their suffering reminded everyone, senators, citizens, slaves, that Rome's order came at a cost, and that cost could be extracted from anyone. This is where the deeper politics come in. The accusations leveled against Vestals often coincided with moments of crisis. Grain shortages, military defeats, political upheavals when Rome trembled, blame was sought. And who better to blame than the women whose bodies symbolized Rome's moral order? By accusing a Vestal of impurity, the city could explain away disaster. The gods were angry, the people were told, but Rome had acted. The guilty had been punished, order restored, and the empire could continue its march. In truth, it was scapegoating. A young woman's life was destroyed to keep the illusion of stability intact. Consider the chilling irony here. These girls, taken from noble families at the age of 8, were promised honor beyond compare. They would ride in carriages through crowded streets, their veils marking them as chosen by the gods. They had front-row seats at games, they were saluted by generals, and even emperors rose when they entered the room. But beneath this honor was fragility. Every smile from the crowd could turn into a glare of accusation. Every bow could turn into a stone thrown at their funeral procession. Their power was a stage prop, their prestige a mask. The real power belonged to the men who decided their fate. This kind of cruelty framed as devotion is not unique to Rome. If you look across history, you'll see the same pattern again and again. Societies often elevate certain figures as sacred priests, virgins, warriors, prophets, and then destroy them when it suits the needs of power. Their suffering is justified in the name of purity, order, or tradition. What Rome did with the Vestals is just one of history's most striking examples. Imagine again the young girl at the start of her service. Her parents weeping as she was taken away. Her childhood ended in an instant. She would live within the house of the Vestals, a grand residence filled with courtyards, fountains, and mosaics. From the outside, it looked like paradise, but from within, it was a gilded prison. Every moment of her life was scripted, every word weighed, every action watched. For 30 years she was bound by laws no man had to endure. And even when her service ended and she was allowed to leave, what future awaited her? Few men dared to marry a former Vestal, fearing divine wrath. Many lived alone, ghosts in a city that once bowed to them. The cruelty, then, was not limited to the punishments. It was woven into the very fabric of their lives. To be chosen as a Vestal was both an honor and a curse. To serve Rome was to serve silence. And the punishments, horrific as they were only the most visible expression of that silence. Now let's draw another contrast. Rome loved to proclaim itself the most civilized society in the world, the bringer of law, order, and justice. It mocked the so-called barbarians beyond its borders, calling them savage and cruel. And yet, inside the very heart of the city, within sight of the Senate and the Forum, young women were beaten, buried, or starved in the name of purity. Civilization, it seems, is often built on carefully hidden barbarity. But history did not forget completely. Ancient writers recorded these punishments, though often with a tone of awe rather than outrage. To them, the Vestal suffering was tragic but necessary. It's only now, looking back with modern eyes, that we see the horror for what it was. And that is why these stories matter. They strip away the marble veneer of Rome and show us the bones beneath. They remind us that no empire, however grand, is free from cruelty. And they force us to ask, what cruelties are we overlooking today, hidden behind our own monuments of progress? Think again of the burial alive. The chamber is dark, the air thin. You wait for rescue that will never come. You whisper prayers to a goddess who does not answer. Outside, the people cheer, believing Rome is safe once more. Now think of the silence of starvation, the lonely courtyards, the forbidden words. You are surrounded by beauty, but consumed by despair. And finally, hear the sound of the lash, each strike echoing in the sacred halls of Vesta, turning the holiest space into a chamber of suffering. These images are not just history. They are echoes, warning us to look closer at the stories societies tell themselves. Because in the end, the Vestal story is not just about ancient Rome. It is about power, sacrifice, and the ways human beings justify cruelty in the name of something higher. Their punishments were horrific, but the silence around them was even worse. And by breaking that silence now, by telling their stories, we refuse to let Rome's cruelty remain hidden in the shadows of history.